Good morning. I love the response. This makes me so happy. It's my great pleasure this morning to introduce Cesar Cuauhtémoc Garcia Hernandez, who is going to be speaking about his book, Migrating to Prison, America's Obsession with Locking Up Immigrants. Professor Garcia Hernandez teaches at the University of Denver, Sturm College of Law. And this book is wonderful. I've had the chance to read it. I encourage everybody to go out and buy a copy. There's also some at the Bazell. It's a really quick, amazing read that gives us a great amount of information about the United States' reliance on prisons to enforce immigration law. And I'll just cite one person or one review. Kirkus called it a chilling, timely overview of the American tendency to first exploit and then criminalize migrants. Cesar speaks all over about his work. He is someone you might hear on NPR as you drive to work tomorrow, or read in the New York Times, or The Guardian, or Newsweek, or Salon, or MSNBC, or BBC, CNN. You will find him all over the place. And he also publishes a blog that is a wonderful resource, crimmigration.com. It's a blog about the convergence of immigration law and criminal law, which is his specialty. And his first book, Crimmigration Law, is actually one that my students know because it is assigned reading in my class. So I have long been a fan. I'm thrilled to have him here. Please welcome Professor Garcia Hernandez.
Good morning, everyone. Thanks for being here. It's an honor to be at the University of Oklahoma for this fantastic event. Thank you to Justin for inviting me. Thank you to Kit for the introduction, and of course to Helen Green for all of the work that went into making sure that I and everyone else was able to get here today. So, like Professor Johnson just says, my focus is certainly on migration, and I'll be talking about Migrating to Prison, this book that I recently published. But before I jump into the substance of the book, I want to talk a little bit about, give you a little bit of context about myself. Is the microphone working okay? Yeah, so I think if somebody can raise the volume on the mic, that'd be great. All right. Well, yeah, I'll try not to move, but if y'all have a lav mic, I'll take that. But for me, so to give you a little bit more context about myself, about the and why it is that I decided to focus on the use of incarceration as a means of enforcing immigration law, I think it's helpful to have a sense of where I come to this work from. So migration has always been a part of my lived experience. I was born and raised in McAllen, Texas, which is a city just a few miles north of the Rio Grande River in South Texas, the area of South Texas, and northern Mexico in the southeastern part of Texas. And at that time, like now, my family straddled that international boundary. My parents' work did for a time. My father was my family was living on the Mexican side of the border. My father was working on the U.S. side. My siblings' births straddled that border, as was common then and remains common. My siblings, most of my siblings were born in Texas, but while my family was living in Reynosa, which is a fairly large city right on the Mexican side of the border. And so my daily existence did. Their daily existence, my daily existence did. Border crossings were just a routine facet of life for us, for visiting family, for shopping, for lunch, for medical appointments. We had very much a binational existence we had a bicultural existence. We do. And very much a bilingual experience. And that allowed me, that allowed my family to be comfortable in two worlds, in two countries. But it also allowed us a sense of being comfortable in what I think is very much a singular experience. It is the distinct experience of life in the borderlands. And it's there in that region of South Texas and northern Mexico that my parents managed to raise 5 kids in a migrant farm worker housing project by doing what many other folks have had to do all over the place, by scrimping at times, by scrounging at times. I remember very clearly when we were young, we'd go to high school football games, and there's just, being Texas, like Oklahoma, there's no shortage of high school football game opportunities. Only we would not go for the games. We would go when the games were winding down toward the end of the fourth quarter, because we were there to walk through the stands after the people left. We were there to collect the empty cans, because the aluminum was recyclable. And we weren't doing it because of any sense of environmental stewardship. We were doing it because there was a recycling plant in McAllen that would pay us for taking large trash bags full of empty cans. We did this for most of our childhood. And we did this because my parents our family didn't have very much money. My father worked in a hardware store for most of his adult life. My mother cleaned homes for most of her working life. And that was our situation because my parents didn't have a whole lot of formal education. My father finished high school in McAllen, in Texas. My mom finished the 3rd grade, and in the small town in the central state of Querétaro, which is in the central Mexican state of Querétaro. And as the story goes, she finished the 3rd grade twice. And it wasn't because she was doing poorly. It was on the contrary, because she really liked school. But the thing is, school only went through the 3rd grade for her in her community, and so she was able to convince her parents, her father, to allow her to go an additional year to school, and so that meant she had to do 3rd grade twice. But of course, the point being that they didn't have much by way of formal education, and to this day I don't know if it's because of that or despite that, but whatever the reason was, education was absolutely everything to my parents when it came to my siblings and to me, to their kids. They filled my mind with the ambition for learning that they had simply been unable to access for themselves, and in that way they prepared me to thrive in worlds that not only did I not know existed, but of course that they didn't know existed. This continues to be true today. My father's passed away now, but my mom still struggles to understand what it is I do for a living. Right? You're a lawyer, but you don't go to an office and represent clients, right? But you're a teacher. But what are you doing right now? You just travel around talking to people about this book that you wrote. Tenures, they can't fire you. What does that mean? That they can't? You don't. Well, who's your boss? Right? No, it's definitely not the dean. Just to be clear. So it was certainly very much not necessarily a unique experience. And my family certainly is not the only one to have ever been in circumstances like these, but it was a defining experience. And when I left that in-between space of the borderlands, what's often referred to as an area that's ni de aquí ni de allá, not from here nor from there, I found myself startled and unmoored in this next context in which I found myself, which was college. I was studying, I went to college in Rhode Island, in New England, and I was so clueless about what I was getting into. that when my parents and my two brothers and I were driving to Rhode Island, we were waiting to cross a bridge because that's what you do when you drive onto an island. And if you've ever been to Rhode Island, you would know that it's not actually an island, so there is no bridge. I now know that, but not at the time. So I was completely clueless about what was going on, and needless to say, I continued being clueless, unmoored when I got to campus. I was studying at Brown University, and the amount of wealth that was on display there institutionally and also individually in the students was absolutely beyond my comprehension. So I was disoriented there. I was disoriented a few years later when I returned to school to pursue a law degree. But in both of those instances, I eventually found the courage to transcend in that childhood of crossing boundaries. And it was through those experiences far away from that community in South Texas and Northern Mexico that breathed life into me that I was able to see what had not been apparent to me as a child. As a kid, knowing no other way of doing things, no other way of life, I've been unable to see the power that the border had over the bodies that tried to cross it. I did not know that the border patrol, that La Migra, was not an everyday feature of life as experienced by most people in the United States. I did not know that the immigration checkpoints that were permanently located an hour north of my home in South Texas, that they would raise eyebrows in other parts of the United States. I did not know that there was anything unusual about having a tío occasionally sleeping on our couch in the living room as he was trying to make his way north to go to work. I did not realize the power that the law had in my daily experience, in the daily experiences of the people who were my community, who are my family, until I had the opportunity to get out of that comfort zone and reflect on where it was that I'd been. And even then, though, there was one facet of life in that community that remained hidden from me until I returned to the region as a newly minted lawyer, with a shiny bar card in hand, and I started representing clients who were facing deportation proceedings alongside my two brothers in our small family law firm. And that facet of life that continued to remain hidden from my view until then was the focus of my latest book, Migrating to Prison, Immigration Prisons. Because all of a sudden I found myself representing clients who were stuck inside detention centers that I had not known existed. Sometimes these facilities were surrounded by onion fields. Other times they were tucked into gorgeous wildlife refuges. And I remember very clearly the first time that I drove to one of these facilities, the Port Isabel Detention Center. It's about 1,500 beds. It's been there since the mid-1980s. And I remember driving through there looking at these gorgeous white birds that were just sort of hanging around these native ponds called resacas, and I'd never seen anything like that before. They're white egrets. I know that now. I didn't know that at the time. And I remember driving through there, wondering how it is that this place had existed without me knowing, given that I'd spent most of my life there up until that time. And I kept driving, and eventually I get to the guardhouse at the perimeter of the Port Isabel Detention Center. And off in the distance, you can see there's the fencing that surrounds the high or the concrete walls of the prison facility. And just to get to the parking lot, you have to go through one security checkpoint, and then you park, and in order to get inside the facility, you go through a second layer of security checkpoints. And inside the facility, there are steel doors. There are surveillance cameras watching every move. There are escorts who accompany people like me, the rare attorney going inside to meet with a client in a cinder block room. And I say the rare attorney because in the prison network that is run by the Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency, like the Port Isabel Detention Center, most of the folks who are going through the immigration court process while they're locked up in places like that don't have access to a lawyer. We used to joke back when I was working alongside my brothers full time that we were the largest immigration prison, the largest law firm in the region that went inside these facilities. There were 3 of us. And then never got around to actually verifying whether that was true, so it might not have been, but it was close enough. Now, I'm now privileged to call myself a law professor, a teacher, a writer, and I've been writing for more than a decade about this intersection between criminal law and immigration law, and about the criminalization of migrants themselves. And incarceration is just the harshest reality of this trend. It's the part of immigration policing that led to the death of a man named Kamyar Samimi. Mr. Samimi had been in the United States for about 40 years. He had a green card. And one day ICE showed up, Immigration and Customs Enforcement agents showed up at his door, at home. And they arrested him, and they took him down to an immigration prison, a private immigration prison in Aurora, Colorado, a suburb of Denver. And despite 40 years in the United States, within 2 weeks, he was dead. And the press release that the government issued soon thereafter said that Mr. Samimi died suddenly. But the internal governmental investigation report that was released only a year later after an open records request by a local journalist and a separate lawsuit by the local ACLU said that the nurses at the facility had not followed the medical instructions issued by the doctor. So immigration prisons are the places where our government oftentimes oversees suffering. They're the places where the quality of life suffers, and indeed at times where life goes to end, as it did with Mr. Samimi. And so I've concluded that immigration prisons are not defensible. In this latest book, Migrating the Prison, I trace how the United States, at one point in our history, got really close to shutting down almost all of the immigration prisons that existed at the time, and then how, for the next 25 years or so, life went on without them. And then I also describe how, starting in the late 1970s, the United States began to build the largest immigration prison system in the world. Today, the United States locks up roughly 400,000 or 500,000 people every single year because the government thinks that they violated immigration law. In immigration prisons, there are people who are held under the power of what lawyers call civil law, because the government says that they might not belong here, that they instead belong somewhere else, over some border somewhere. And there are also people who are being held under the power of criminal law, because the government says that they should be punished for having come here. Today, immigration prisons are just about everywhere, and they take just about every form. From an old motel in Tucson sitting along Interstate 10 to a concrete fortress of 1,400 beds in Tacoma, a suburb of Washington. Now, some people are there because the government has given them permission to be here and now wants to strip them of that permission to be here. Take Jerry Armijo, who I write about in Migrating the Prison. Jerry was raised in South Texas, not far from where I grew up. We were both raised in this poor, overwhelmingly Mexican community, only I was born north of the Rio Grande River, and Jerry was born on its southern side. And that means that I was born a United States citizen, and Jerry was not. And after high school, I went off to the Ivy League, and I was being shocked by a different culture. And Jerry joined the U.S. Army. And he got deployed to Iraq, where he was being shocked by bombs. And one day, as Jerry was patrolling in his tank on behalf of the U.S. Army, his tank went over an IED. And that IED blasted right through the bottom of the vehicle. It injured Jerry's leg. It gave him some trauma, PTSD. And he got sent back to Texas to get better. Only when he got there, he didn't get the care that he needed. And so, like many people before him and after him, Jerry started to self-medicate with drugs. And eventually, the police caught up with him, and he was going through the criminal justice system. He was participating in a special court set up specifically for veterans, specifically out of a recognition that oftentimes the trauma of war manifests in harmful ways, in antisocial ways, when those soldiers come back to their homes. And he was doing exactly as the judge asked of him. Until one day, all of a sudden, he just stopped showing up to court. Turns out, ICE had picked him up. And they'd sent him to one of their local immigration prisons, the Port Isabel Detention Center, where they were starting the process of deporting Jerry. Because Jerry was not a U.S. citizen. He's still not a U.S. citizen. So one bomb, a shoddy mental health care system, and as Jerry will readily admit, a few bad decisions later, and all of a sudden, Jerry had been transformed from what politicians like to refer to as a war hero or as a wounded warrior to a criminal alien. So Jerry had the government's permission to be here, and they were trying to take that away from him. But there are other folks who are locked up in some of these facilities who are there because they dared to seek safety in the United States. Federal law is clear that anyone who is physically present in the United States and who is afraid for their life can ask for asylum. It does not matter where you came from. It does not matter how you got here. And yet, coming to the United States without the federal government's permission is also a federal crime. And that's why in the summer of 2018, we all saw immigration officials taking children away from their parents. And the kids were being sent off to places like that old motel in Tucson, that instead of having a sign at the door welcoming guests, now it has a sign that's warning away visitors. And instead of having around-the-clock help at the front desk, now it has around-the-clock surveillance cameras, making sure that no one leaves without permission. And while the kids were in places like that, the parents were being prosecuted in federal courthouses like the one in McAllen, Texas, for having violated federal immigration crime. Now, before then and after then, parents have been confined alongside their kids. Kids like Diego Osorio Rivera. When Diego was just 1 year old, his mother Wendy decided that life in Honduras had become too dangerous for them to stay. And so like people from all over the world have done for generations, Diego and Wendy decided to come to the United States for safety. And when they got here, in one of those miraculous ways that are wholly ordinary for many migrants, they asked for asylum. And within a few days, they found themselves inside an old nursing home outside of Philadelphia. ICE calls it a family residential center, but critics prefer the phrase baby jail. Diego and Wendy were stuck inside that old nursing home, waiting for the legal process to slowly grind forward. Remember, I said Diego was just 1 year old when he got here. He turned 2 inside that facility. And then he turned 3 inside that facility. And eventually he won his legal claim to stay in the United States, but not before 650 nights had passed. To run this immigration prison system, the federal government relies primarily on 5 agencies. There's the Customs and Border Protection and Immigration and Customs Enforcement divisions of the Department of Homeland Security. There's the U.S. Marshal Service, there's the Federal Bureau of Prisons, and there's the Department of Health and Human Services Office of Refugee Resettlement. primarily through its Border Patrol agents, CBP, Customs and Border Patrol Protection Agency, apprehends and detains people along the border, primarily the southwestern border, who it suspects of having entered the United States without the government's permission. And it keeps them in small cells that are designed for short-term use, most commonly inside of Border Patrol stations. In my native South Texas, these often resemble really large dog kennels. These are enormous cages built of chain link fencing that are tucked inside warehouse-looking parts of Border Patrol stations. CBP's cousin agency within DHS, ICE, is responsible for detaining people who the federal government is trying to figure out whether they're going to be allowed to remain in the United States. And to do this, it relies on hundreds of facilities across the country, most of which are nothing more than county jails. ICE is just renting bed space from usually the county sheriff. Now, others are standalone facilities that are operated by private prison corporations. And the two largest players in this market are CoreCivic and the Geo Group. And each of them, or collectively rather, they make up about 2/3 to 3/4 of the entire population of ISIS detainees. For its part, the U.S. Marshal Service is responsible for pretrial confinement of migrants who are suspected of violating a federal immigration crime, and more than people suspected of violent crimes or financial crimes. Immigration crime defendants are the most likely type of federal suspect to be detained pending prosecution. Upon conviction, and most of these folks will be convicted, they're handed over to the Bureau of Prisons for punishment, and the BOP in turn sends them into its network of prisons. The last of the federal agencies with a large role is the Office of Refugee Resettlement, which doesn't run its own facilities anywhere. It contracts with nonprofits. And its main customer is an agency called Southwest Keys, which is based in Austin, Texas, that runs about 24 sites. In Tucson, Southwest Keys runs that old motel. Down in Brownsville, Texas, it uses an old Walmart. Every year, roughly 500,000 people total are deprived of their liberty because they violated immigration law, or at least because federal officials claim that they did. And as some people enter and others exit the nation's immigration prisons, migrants are being counted. The federal government alone spends billions of dollars on immigration prisons every year, $2.7 billion in 2017 just for the ICE detention network. And this largesse is welcome news for the private businesses and local governments. CoreCivic and Geo both get about 50% of their revenue from the federal government, and with that they hire people. They hire people in out-of-the-way locations where decent paid jobs are sometimes difficult to come by. In 3,000-person Milan, New Mexico, and about an hour and a half west of Albuquerque, 300 people work for CoreCivic. And to elected officials, the threat to their high-employment private prison is a threat to their re-election campaigns. In 2015, to give you just one example, inmates at the Willacy County Detention Center in Raymondville, Texas, left it uninhabitable. And I was not surprised because I'd represented clients there, and it was always chaotic. The Bureau of Prisons, though, which was under contract with the Management and Training Corporation, the private prison that ran it, the Bureau of Prisons pulled its convicted immigration offenders out of that facility. It ended its contract with Management and Training Corporation after that incident. And a few years later, in 2018, the facility was reopened, but this time it had a different customer, federal government agency customer, ICE. And now it houses the people who are facing the possibility of removal from the United States. And when the refurbished prison was ramping up to reopen, the elected county judge in Willacy County, Texas, which is in South Texas, said this. He said, "They are committed to the well-being of the people in their care. As you know, the last few years have been financially challenging for the county. So we look forward to this new facility and the economic benefits it will bring to our area." Well, why is the county so interested? It owns the prison. MTC just runs it. And having prisoners on the inside means that MTC can hire guards and it can hire nurses, and it also means that the county can pay its bills. So these private and public immigration prisons have support all the way from Washington down to Willacy County, and so it would seem that the future is quite bright for immigration prisons. In this topsy-turvy world, our collective moral compass has swerved to the point where we no longer debate whether we ought to be detaining children. Instead, locking up children with their mothers is offered as the humanitarian response to separating children from their parents. So when that is our reality, then imaginations have already run wild. When what was once a fantasy for some and a nightmare for others has become policy for all of us. So if nightmares can become a reality, then why can't dreams? So I imagine a future without immigration prisons, which I know is not a small task. To begin, though, I think it is possible, though. And to begin, let me point out that at one point we came close to doing this. Most people think of Ellis Island as that place that welcomed generations of newcomers to the United States, and it did that. But it was also an immigration prison with an ironic view of the Statue of Liberty. One woman who was held there in the late 1940s and the early 1950s recalls in her memoir, a woman named Ellen Knopf recalls in her memoir approaching the facility for the first time, and she said it had the look of a group of kennels. A group of kennels. Just like today, in that period in the late 40s and the 50s, immigration prisons like the one on Ellis Island were said to protect us from ungodly dangers. Today it's gang members or terrorists. But back then, it was communists. The Soviet Union was recovering from that immense pounding that it had taken during World War II. The Cold War had started, and it was not just ideological fights that were being had. It had turned into actual military engagements in places like Korea. And that little speck of land off the coast of southern Manhattan was supposed to keep us safe from people like that woman Ellen Knopf. By the 1950s, when Ellen Knopf was held there, she was the wife of a veteran of the U.S. Army. She fled Czechoslovakia, where she'd been born, as the war got started. She made her way to the UK, where she worked for the Royal Air Force. Then she worked for the U.S. And that's how she met Kurt Knopf, U.S. citizen and veteran of the U.S. Army. They got married in Germany with the permission of the commanding officer. And thanks to a special procedure enacted by Congress, specifically to allow soldiers to bring their new wives back to their homes, a law called the War Brides Act. She came to the United States. She arrived in New York, and she was told, you cannot step foot inside the United States. You cannot come into the United States because your presence is prejudicial to our interests. But we won't tell you why. We won't tell you what that evidence is. And so you can either go back or you can wait in these restrictive quarters of the Ellis Island station. So she went to Ellis Island and she insisted on being allowed to join her new family. Insisted all the way to the Supreme Court, where she found no luck. She was confined there until eventually she found no luck at the Supreme Court. She did find luck in editorial boards. She did find luck in members of Congress, so she was able to pressure the Attorney General to give her a hearing, not because the Attorney General was required to, but because the Attorney General wanted to. And so it eventually turns out that the government wasn't comfortable with the secret evidence. They never really disclosed what it was, but they did say it was just hearsay. It was just rumor. So eventually she was able to get off the island and join her new family, and eventually that relationship fell apart. It's never ideal to start a new marriage with one half of the couple being locked up for 2 years. So by the time that Ellen was on the Ellis Island facility, it was in the facility, it was old. It'd been around for a few decades and needed to be repaired, replaced, discarded. And in the White House at the time was the war hero turned Republican president, Dwight Eisenhower. And yet, instead of fixing up the facility, Eisenhower chose to shut it down. On November 11, 1954, his Attorney General, a man named Herbert Brownell, went to a naturalization proceeding at Ebbets Field, home of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And while he was there, he announced a new position that the government was to take. He said, "Today, the little island between the Statue of Liberty and the skyline and piers of New York seems to have served its purpose." A few days later, the New York Times reported the last detained alien, a Norwegian seaman who had overstayed his shore leave, was a passenger on the Battery-bound ferry. Well, that overstay language is important because in immigration law, overstay means you had the government's permission to come here. And that time came and went, and you are still here. You are in violation of immigration law now. And so this was a time when, yes, people were violating immigration law, and yes, the government knew about it. This Norwegian seaman, his name was Arne Peterson, was violating immigration law. The U.S. government knew it, and the U.S. government had him in its possession, and it was the U.S. government that put him on a ferry into southern Manhattan. And neither the U.S. government nor anyone else knows what happened to Mr. Peterson after that day. So if the Cold War wasn't enough to stop Eisenhower from shutting down immigration prisons, then I think it's time for us, 65 years later, to be equally courageous. I think we have to stop constraining our vision of what is deemed to be possible. And so I'll close with a line from a man who knew how to blow fire onto pages, James Baldwin, who in his essay, The Fire Next Time, says this. He writes, "I know that what I'm asking is impossible, but in our time, as in every time, the impossible is the least that one can demand." We have to ask for the impossible because we know what happens if we don't alter course. But instead of getting mired in all of that despair, I hope that we can push our country toward a future that, at least when it comes to the lack of immigration prisons, looks a bit more like our past than it does our present. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We'd like to open the floor now for questions. If anybody has a question, raise a hand and we will get a microphone to you so everyone can hear your question.
So I'm Mari Fagan. I'm a graduate of the University of Oklahoma. So Eisenhower closed the immigration prisons. Under whose administration? Were they reopened? And what is a brief history of that?
Thank you for that question. The Carter administration. In the late 1970s, we started seeing an increase in the number of Haitians who were coming to the United States, fleeing the Duvalier regime. And caught off guard, the Carter administration started rounding people up, sending them onto military bases, sending them into federal penitentiaries, wherever they could find space. That was the very end of the 1970s. Reagan enters the White House soon thereafter, and it's in that moment that we start seeing an increase in the number of Cubans coming to the United States, but primarily poor and primarily dark-skinned Cubans who were at the time described in prominent media and political circles as being the cast-offs from Castro's prisons. The best example of this that I can give you is a fictional example, Scarface, in the 1980s Al Pacino blockbuster. The very opening scene, it's a horrible movie, so don't watch it, but I do recommend the first 30 seconds or so. Opening scene is described, there's some text that appears, and it's describing, setting the stage as being focused on this one character named Tony Montana. but it describes him as having come to the United States as part of this group of migrants who leave the island from the port of Mariel. And it says these people were, the movie says, the dregs of society. Right? This is a sensationalized version of a very real conversation that was happening at the time. Not at all coincidental is the fact that Haitians and the Cubans who were coming in this moment were poor people and were dark-skinned, black or dark-skinned individuals. And so Carter begins it, Reagan formalizes it.
We have other questions. We have one back there. Can you raise your hand again so she sees you? Thank you.
This is probably not an area that you would want to explore, but the horror of having these children removed from their parents has also a psychological effect for our country or wherever they end up, because a child psychiatrist friend of mine listed in Who's Who in America told me that between the ages of 5 to 7, a child makes a decision as to whether the world is safe or dangerous, and what that can do to a child's brain and their beliefs and their reactions in the future can be very, very bad. And what is happening to these children is far beyond just the physical imprisonment.
Thank you for that comment. That's in part why the United Nations, the American Academy of Pediatrics, other interested societies of that type have very categorical position that children should never be confined for any reason whatsoever. And I often get the question, well, these are not maximum security prisons. No, they're not maximum security prisons, right? These are every jail looks somewhat different. Every prison looks somewhat different. But at the end of the day, you're putting people there against their will, and you're not allowing them to leave, right? For months, or for somebody like Diego, for 2 years. No amount of success in court can ever undo those 650 nights that Diego spent locked up in that facility.
I think we might have time for one more question. The very back row there.
My name is Jamie Lucas, and I'm a graduate of the University of Oklahoma, and I'm also a high school teacher. And in the small community I teach high school, we are more than 70% Native American. And I'm curious because I feel like our immigrants that we're talking about today mostly are about the Mexican Americans. And I wonder if because the first lecturer said we have difficulty defining nativism. Well, we're in Native America, and I'm just curious because I don't feel like the immigration's a problem on the Canadian side because they're not the same skin color. And when I had students who were offended that they were called Native Americans, we have Johnson O'Malley, which is, they give school supplies to Native Americans. So when they ask if anybody would like some JOM supplies, and I look at students and say, would anybody like to go get some supplies? I've had several offended that I thought they were Native American because they were Mexican. And I was like, well, pardon me, sorry that I misunderstood, because to me I felt like Mexican Americans were Native North Americans. And I just wonder if you feel as if you're a Native American, and if you feel like that the immigration problem is mainly skin color problem.
Yeah, so as I recounted early on in my remarks, I mean, my family came to the United States fairly recently from Mexico. So that's my understanding of my own identity. I embrace that understanding, and I'm quite proud of that history and that struggle to allow me to have the opportunities that I now do. But I think the larger point about the sort of complicated interweaving of racism in the United States is an extremely important part of this story, because racism isn't unidimensional, right? It's not white people just sort of imposing that on people of color, because of course people of color are among ourselves very heterogeneous, there is certainly a strain among communities of color that is quite virulently racist. Even today, there is a hierarchy of social privilege in the United States that most of us have a vested interest in trying not to be at the bottom of. And unfortunately, that's the reality in circumstances where we do have such a poor safety net, where the stakes are so high, and where the cleavages historically and today's day have quite often been marked by racialization. And that's unfortunately the reality that we've been struggling with as a political community for most of the history of this nation.
Thank you very much, Professor Garcia Hernandez.
Thank you all
For coming with us today.